Modern researchers are turning to Egypt's oldest inscriptions again, and this time, the findings are raising serious questions. Buried inside ancient Egyptian texts is a pattern that specialists once dismissed, but new analysis suggests there may be a meteorite secret hidden in plain sight. The strange part is how this clue stayed overlooked for more than 4,000 years. It took fresh eyes, updated tools, and a separate scientific breakthrough for anyone to notice what these writings might be pointing to. These inscriptions might be hinting at a material the Egyptians believed came from the sky itself, a connection modern researchers only began to notice after new lab results revealed something surprising. A strange line in a 4,400-year-old wall. The chamber is smaller than most people imagine. When researchers step inside the pyramid of King Yunus, they always mention the same thing first: how close the walls feel. Every surface is covered in carved lines, symbols stacked from floor to ceiling in neat vertical columns. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious writings in Egypt, and they read like a mixture of commands, prayers, and cosmic descriptions meant to guide a king into the afterlife. Most lines follow a familiar pattern that scholars have studied for more than a century. Then, there's the one that breaks the rhythm. It sits a little higher than eye level, carved with the same steady hand as the surrounding spells. Yet the phrasing is different enough that it stops readers mid-translation. In this passage, Yunus is described as reaching upward and interacting with something linked directly to the sky. Egyptologists say the line stands out because of the unusual pairing of concepts, one that doesn't appear often in other early inscriptions. A researcher who examined it during a recent documentation project admitted that the wording didn't fit cleanly into the usual categories of pyramid theology. It was not alarming, just unexpected. These walls have been photographed countless times, but new projects keep returning because scholars believe the pyramid texts still have more to offer. Over the past decade, researchers have re-examined certain lines using updated translations and a better understanding of how early Egyptian language used metaphor. The line in Yunus's pyramid has become one of those passages worth looking at again. Not because it promises a dramatic breakthrough, but because it raises a subtle question about what early Egyptians noticed, valued, and chose to record in symbolic form. One Egyptologist described her first encounter with this passage during a conservation survey. She recalled pausing over the combination of two symbols that normally remained separate. "It felt like a thread pulled loose from the rest of the text," she said. "It suggested a connection that wasn't typical, and that made it worth a second look." That second look eventually led several teams to reconsider whether this inscription reflected something literal, metaphorical, or both. For now, the line remains exactly where it has been for more than 4 millennia, quietly carved into the stone. And although scholars treat it carefully, almost cautiously, they agree on one thing. Whatever the ancient writers meant here, they chose their words with purpose. The question is why? The puzzle of a Metal Egypt should not have had. Long before iron became a common material in human history, Egypt already had a complicated relationship with it. Most viewers picture ancient Egypt filled with gold, lapis, and copper, not iron. Long before iron became a common material in human history, Egypt already had a complicated relationship with it. Most viewers picture ancient Egypt filled with gold, lapis, and copper, not iron. That is because iron simply did not belong to the early chapters of Egyptian technology. According to the archaeological timeline, Egyptians would not learn to smelt iron from ore until much later, closer to the first millennium before our era. Yet when archaeologists catalogue the oldest graves and ceremonial objects from earlier periods, they keep finding something that does not fit that timeline at all. One of the first signs of the puzzle surfaced in the early 20th century at a site called Gezi, a cemetery older than the pharaohs who built pyramids. Inside one grave, researchers found tiny beads that looked like simple decorative pieces. The surprise came later, when modern material analysis revealed the beads were made of iron. Not copper, not bronze, but iron, placed in a burial that predated Egypt's Iron Age by well over 1,000 years. Even the most experienced researchers had to pause. How did iron appear so early, and why did it seem so out of place in Egypt's technological history? The more investigators looked, the more these early iron traces appeared. They were always rare and always associated with elite or ceremonial contexts. A blade edge here, a small ornament there, a decorative piece sealed in a tomb. Each time the finding was documented, the same question returned. Where did the ancient Egyptians get iron at a time when ironworking was not part of their culture?
Iron wasn't so common in Egypt. Egypt is very rich in minerals, copper, and so on, not so much iron.
That question would eventually lead to laboratories across Europe and the United States. Researchers needed to understand the composition of this early iron because the chemical fingerprint could explain its origin. Modern tools made this possible. Scientists used techniques that allowed them to read the metal like a story. Nickel content, trace elements, crystalline structures, temperature histories. These clues helped reconstruct what the metal had experienced long before anyone shaped it into beads or blades. One researcher described seeing the instrument readings appear on her screen while testing one of the early Egyptian samples. The numbers made her stop. She said it felt like watching the metal contradict Egypt's timeline. The readings did not match iron that comes from smelted ore. Instead, they suggested something different, something that should not have been available to a society that had not yet mastered furnace technology. This finding did not resolve the mystery, it only deepened it. If early Egyptians were not smelting iron, and if the metal in their artifacts did not behave like ore-based material, then the source had to be something unusual. This is where the work became more serious. Archaeologists began comparing the metal compositions with known iron signatures in global databases. The results pointed toward origins that were rare but not impossible in the ancient world. Still, the presence of this unusual iron did not fully explain why Egyptians valued it so highly. These iron objects often appeared in graves of high status or were associated with ritual use. Researchers noted that early Egyptians treated certain metals as symbolic materials, each carrying specific meanings. Gold reflected eternity. Lapis represented the heavens. Copper was linked to craftsmanship and transformation. Iron, however, remained harder to categorize. It appeared infrequently, and whenever it appeared, it felt intentional. It was placed with care, as if it carried a meaning beyond its function. As more evidence accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. The oldest iron in Egypt did not appear in everyday life. It appeared in contexts connected to status, protection, journeying, and the divine. This placed the material in a different category, something rare, something meaningful, something people handled with a level of intention that did not match ordinary craft practice. At this point, archaeologists and Egyptologists agreed on one thing. These early iron artifacts challenged long-held assumptions about what early Egyptians understood, valued, and recorded. They hinted at a missing piece in the story, a reason Egyptians placed small but significant iron objects in burials that otherwise followed strict symbolic logic. The timeline was clear. The metal existed in Egypt far earlier than expected. The artifacts were real. The compositions were unusual. The placement was deliberate, but the explanation was still just out of reach. As one researcher put it during a conference lecture, something is happening here that does not follow the usual technological narrative. The puzzle now had weight, evidence, and history behind it. What it still needed was context, and that context would appear not in metal but in language. when science stepped in, reading the metal like a record. For decades, early Egyptian iron objects were mentioned as curiosities in excavation reports. They showed up so rarely and in such unusual contexts that many archaeologists treated them as isolated exceptions. The turning point came when scientists decided to stop treating the metal as an anomaly and instead treat it as a clue. If the traditional technological timeline did not explain the presence of early iron, then perhaps the metal itself could. That idea pushed the research out of the desert and into laboratories. The shift began quietly. Researchers started sending small samples of early Egyptian iron to labs that specialized in analyzing ancient metals. These were places where technicians could break down a fragment's composition with remarkable precision. The goal was simple: determine whether this early iron behaved like regular ore-based iron or whether it carried a different signature. That distinction mattered because different formation processes leave chemical fingerprints that last for thousands of years. One researcher recalled placing a polished cross-section of an Egyptian iron bead into a microscope and immediately noticing the unusual patterns inside it. She said the structure looked unfamiliar for something that should have been smelted. That moment signaled something important. The metal contained elements and textures that did not match what you would expect from early furnace work. It was as if the iron was carrying a history that did not align with Egyptian technology of the time. Further tests deepened the puzzle. Scientists mapped the elements inside several pieces of early Egyptian iron and found elevated nickel levels that did not match typical terrestrial ores. Other trace elements appeared in combinations that were uncommon in smelted material. These readings were consistent across multiple objects and across different time periods. Whatever this iron was, it did not follow the pattern of metal produced by ancient furnaces. Teams then compared these findings with global databases of metal signatures. These databases include records from geological surveys, ancient production centers, and naturally occurring materials. The comparison showed that Egypt's early iron shared strong similarities with metal sources that form under extreme conditions. This did not resolve the debate, but it changed its direction. Instead of asking whether Egyptians smelted iron earlier than expected, researchers were now asking what other sources could have supplied these small but significant pieces. One scientist described the first time she shared her lab results at a conference. She expected a casual discussion, but instead received a round of quiet nods, followed by a series of questions that all circled the same idea. If these artifacts did not match smelted iron, then researchers needed to understand where the material came from. Nobody in that room believed ancient Egyptians were producing iron with advanced tools, so the explanation had to lie elsewhere. This growing body of evidence pushed another question forward. Why were these early iron objects always found in contexts linked to status, protection, or ritual meaning? They were never part of daily tools, never attached to ordinary workshops, and never found in large quantities. The metal appeared rarely, and when it did, it seemed purposeful. That pattern suggested people recognized its uniqueness long before science could explain it. There was another observation that caught researchers' attention. Many early iron pieces showed almost no wear. They were polished, decorated, and carefully shaped, yet clearly not used like tools or weapons. One Egyptologist examining a fragment during a museum study session noted how untouched it looked compared to copper tools marked by daily use. It felt almost ceremonial, an object meant to signal status or belief rather than serve a practical purpose. And that's where the surprising part surfaced. This iron appears in graves and treasuries long before Egypt had the ability to produce it, suggesting that its value came not from function, but from what it was believed to represent. By the time several research teams published their findings, a new picture had emerged. The early iron in Egypt did not fit into the expected technological framework. It did not behave like furnace-produced iron. It did not spread through society the way copper and bronze did. Instead, it moved quietly through elite circles, appearing in graves, tombs, and ceremonial spaces. The metal itself now stood as evidence of something unusual, something that challenged the traditional timeline. But metal alone could not fully explain the pattern. To understand why these objects were treated so differently, researchers needed to look beyond laboratories and turn their attention back to something far older. The next step in the investigation required examining the language Egyptians used when they described this strange material. The language clue hidden in Egypt's oldest texts. While the scientific testing of early Egyptian iron raised new questions, the next set of clues came from a very different place: the grammar and symbolism inside ancient writings. Egyptologists often say that the culture expressed complex ideas through layers of metaphor, wordplay, and visual cues. If early iron carried a special meaning, then something in the language might show it. That idea led researchers back to the same walls introduced earlier, but this time with tools designed to decode how the ancient world used symbols to communicate more than one meaning at a time. Egyptian hieroglyphs, especially in their earliest forms, do not behave like modern writing. A single word could carry both a literal meaning and a symbolic layer that pointed to a concept or natural force. This is why the pyramid texts attract so much attention. They are not only religious writings, they are linguistic fossils. Every column carved into the stone preserves how Egyptians talked about their world, their materials, and the forces they believed shaped existence. So when researchers noticed that iron sometimes appeared in unusual linguistic company, it became worth a closer look. One Egyptologist explained it this way during a lecture: when a material is rare or powerful, the language surrounding it becomes metaphorical, she said. People reach for symbols that signal significance. With that in mind, she and her colleagues began tracing how the word for iron appeared in different periods. The first surprise was that the spelling and determinatives associated with the word shifted over time. Some forms used signs connected to tools or hardness, which made sense. Others, however, included a determinative that hinted at something broader, something that did not fit neatly into the category of practical metalwork. This discovery led researchers to analyze the contexts where the unusual forms of the word appeared. These were not instructions or craft manuals. They were ritual lines, funerary passages, and descriptions connected to the heavens, the afterlife, or divine action. The placement alone was unusual. Why would a metal that early Egyptians barely used appear in texts that described interactions between gods, kings, and cosmic forces? Another scholar pointed to the structure of certain lines in the pyramid texts that linked iron to upward movement or skyward imagery. She emphasized that the Egyptians frequently tied their materials to natural or cosmic symbols. Gold represented the sun, silver reflected the moon, lapis and turquoise stood in for the sky's colors. If iron appeared alongside language associated with the upper world, it might suggest the writers were referencing a quality they believed the material possessed. Still, these were interpretations, not conclusions. Egyptologists avoid overstating what a single symbol or word form can prove. They work slowly, comparing decades of inscriptions and multiple translation traditions. Yet, as the linguistic patterns accumulated, a larger question formed. Why did the Egyptians choose to place a largely foreign to them metal in the same conceptual category as elements tied to the heavens? A researcher who studied Old Kingdom texts described the moment she realized the connection might be intentional rather than accidental. During a translation review, she noticed that two passages use similar metaphors, pairing a rare material with an action involving the sky. She didn't make a claim, but she highlighted the pattern in her notes. Later, when colleagues compared linguistic data sets, they noticed similar pairings elsewhere. Each instance on its own could be dismissed as poetic wording. Taken together, they pointed toward a shared underlying idea. As one scholar put it, language rarely invents meaning without reason. If people use a metaphor repeatedly, something about that metaphor makes sense to them. That comment stayed with researchers because it tied directly into an emerging interpretation. The inscriptions were not describing everyday metalwork or mundane iron. They were hinting at a quality they believed this rare material held. By now, two investigative threads had taken shape. One came from laboratories studying the metal itself. The other came from the inscriptions that surrounded it, and as both threads grew stronger, they began pointing, quietly but consistently, in the same direction. The next step would not confirm a theory outright, but it would pull both lines of evidence together in a way that modern researchers did not expect when this work first began. When two lines of evidence finally met. By the time specialists compared the laboratory results with the linguistic patterns, both groups realized they had been working on different halves of the same puzzle. The metal told one story, the inscriptions hinted at another, and together they revealed something far more coherent than anyone expected when the research began. The turning point came when a group of Egyptologists met with materials scientists to review their findings side by side. The meeting was intended to be routine, a simple exchange of data. Instead, it created the moment researchers now point to when explaining how this investigation shifted. One scientist presented the results from the early iron artifacts first, showing that the metal's nickel-rich composition matched material known to originate from meteorites rather than smelted ore. The evidence was clear. Whatever this iron was, it had formed under conditions that did not exist on Earth's surface. Then the Egyptologists followed with their own findings, outlining how the word for iron in certain ancient Egyptian texts appeared in contexts that connected it symbolically to the sky. They pointed to rare determinatives, unusual pairings, and ritual passages that placed the material in conceptual proximity to the heavens. When the two presentations ended, someone in the room observed that the metal's origin and the language's symbolism were pointing in the same direction. That observation carried weight. It meant that the two investigative paths, which had been operating independently, now supported one conclusion. The Egyptians were not simply encountering a rare metal, they were encountering a rare metal that came from above, and their language reflected that understanding in ways scholars had only recently begun to decode. As one researcher summarized it, modern scientists were now seeing what ancient writers had encoded thousands of years earlier. This is the point at which several scholars began to describe the findings informally as a kind of meteorite secret hidden in ancient Egyptian texts. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sweeping claim, but a quiet recognition that the inscriptions and the artifacts aligned in a way that made sense. The pyramid texts were not describing ordinary iron. They were describing a material associated with the sky, a material the Egyptians encountered in small, precious fragments. And modern researchers, reviewing the evidence together, realized that the ancient description was far more literal than previously assumed. During interviews, a few scientists admitted that the alignment between the textual symbolism and the material composition felt surprisingly direct. One described it as the moment the timeline finally clicked into place. Another noted that the consistency across multiple artifacts and multiple inscriptions offered proof that was already there, waiting for someone to connect the dots. These were not bold claims. They were acknowledgments that both forms of evidence supported a shared interpretation. What made this discovery important was not just the metal or the inscriptions, but the interplay between them. The Egyptians handled meteorites without knowing the modern word for them, and they used the metal in ways that communicated value, rarity, and a connection to the heavens. Their texts encoded that meaning through metaphors, determinatives, and ritual phrasing. Equipped with analytical tools and a stronger understanding of Egyptian symbolism, recognized that alignment only after approaching the problem from two different directions. In this sense, the reveal is not the kind that overturns history, but the kind that clarifies it. Modern researchers revealed a meteorite secret that had been preserved in ancient Egyptian texts all along, not by accident, but because the Egyptians themselves treated the metal as something that came from above. Their language reflected that belief. Their artifacts confirmed it. With the two lines of evidence now connected, scholars turned to a new question. What did this celestial material mean within the larger world of Egyptian ritual and kingship, and why was it used the way it was? What the reveal means for Egypt's story. Once the two lines of evidence were brought together, the discussion shifted from how the discovery was made to what it actually meant. Scholars describe this phase as the moment when the work stopped being about iron and texts and started being about people. The early Egyptians who handled this rare metal were not experimenting with unfamiliar tools. They were working with something they recognized as special, and they placed it in contexts that reflected status, belief, and cosmic identity. This is where the implications matter. The reveal does not claim that ancient Egyptians understood astronomy in a modern scientific sense. It does show that they were careful observers of their world. When a rare material entered their lives, they noticed its unusual qualities and assigned it meaning through rituals, placement, and language. In this case, their language happened to line up with what modern analysis eventually confirmed, which explains why researchers described the alignment as surprising rather than sensational. Egyptologists now view these early iron objects as part of a broader pattern in Egyptian thought. Materials were never just physical substances. They carried symbolic weight and played roles in guiding kings, protecting the dead, or connecting the earthly and the divine. Iron, because of its rarity and distinctive qualities, appears to have been treated as a material linked to powers beyond ordinary craft. This interpretation helps explain why early iron objects were found in elite burials and ritual spaces rather than workshops or domestic settings. The discovery also demonstrates how interdisciplinary research changes historical understanding. Linguists, archaeologists, and scientists worked independently before realizing their findings overlapped. That overlap created a new perspective, and scholars say it will likely influence future interpretations of early texts. Other materials may reveal similar patterns once examined through combined approaches. For now, the reveal stands as a reminder that the ancient world often left clues in more than one place. Some appear in artifacts, others appear in language. When both point in the same direction, the historical picture becomes clearer. And in this case, it opened a window into how early Egyptians understood a rare and meaningful material long before science could explain its true origin. If ancient Egyptians recognized the value of a metal that literally fell from the sky, what other clues might still be hiding in their texts or artifacts that modern researchers haven't connected yet? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Catch you in the next one.